Still light outside. Make the most of the end of summer, because it soon won't be light at 6 o'clock. Thank you for joining us this evening. Oh, that's disconcerting. There's my face. We have an hour and a half in front of us. My name's Alison and I'm Vice Chair of Labour Housing Group, and we're going to organise this in a bit of a three-hander. So I'm going to take us through the first half hour, followed by Alex, followed by Heather. We've put record on, so if anyone's unhappy with that, please can you let Joss know in the chat. But we will be making tonight's recording available on our YouTube channel, and also as a result of the discussions and the Q&As and presentations we're here tonight, Alex will be writing a sort of very in-depth report for our Red Brick blog. It's always difficult to say, and we will be sending that in to the party as part of the consultation on the NPPF. So to kick off, we have got Russell Curtis joining us for the first half hour. Russell is the founding director of RCKA, a London-based architectural practice. But I was talking to him earlier, and he's one of those interesting people who is not just siloed in his own profession, so also an expert on planning, and he is a member of the quality review panels for Barnet Council and Newham, as well as doing lots and lots of other things within the built environment. So Russell is going to talk to us for 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, and then we're going to do a Q&A with him. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and that'll mean that we can get through as much as we possibly can. So I think Russell is going to share some screens. So if you share some slides, so if you just give us a second while we set that up, and then we'll hand over to Russell.
Can you see that, Alison?
Perfect.
Great stuff. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Alison said, I'm an architect, but I have an unhealthy interest in planning. Most planning consultants and planners sort of say that they're failed architects, but I think it's the other way around for me. I'm started off as an architect, and I'm increasingly interested in planning policy. But I don't claim to be an expert, so there will no doubt be some people on this call who know a lot more about this than I do, but perhaps there'll be some that don't know so much. So I'll just take you through it, and I'll assume that people don't know very much about the NPPF. That's the National Planning Policy Framework. So I'm going to start from the very beginning. Obviously, it's a big topic. We couldn't cover the entire thing in 15 minutes, but I'll tell you some highlights. So what is the NPPF? Well, there it is. It's hardly a glorious piece of graphic design, but that's the document from the current NPPF from December last year. So this was the last Conservative government's version of the NPPF. But essentially, what it does is this document sets out the government's planning policies for England, how they should be applied. So every other piece of planning policy, so regional plans in the case of London, local plans and neighbourhood plans, should in theory at least be in alignment with the NPPF. Now, clearly those things happen at different paces and different stages, so there's always some discrepancy between them, but essentially every piece of planning policy should be in alignment with the National Planning Policy Framework. It's worth noting that as of June, only 22% of planning authorities have an updated local plan. So there is a big discrepancy in the implementation of even the current NPPF at the local level. So the big thing that's happened since the election is that we've now got a new version, or a consultation version of the NPPF that was brought in by the new Labour government very quickly, and focuses predominantly on housing. So I'm going to be focusing on housing this evening rather than some of the other things that the NPPF contains. And some of those changes, proposed changes, are things like and I'm not going to go into these too much detail, but presumption in favour, cross-boundary working between authorities, changing to housing need, housing land supply, economic growth, green belt, and interestingly, the latest version, because it's sort of included as a track changes, so you can see all the things that the proposals take out. It expunges the idea of beauty from the document, which was an inclusion in the December version last year. So I'm going to focus on these things. The NPPF covers all planning policy, but we're going to be talking about housing predominantly. We've already seen some of the recent stuff on economic growth, so call-ins on things like solar farms and onshore wind turbines that have been allowed immediately as the new government coming in. But I'm going to focus on housing. So that's the new version. I mean, it looks very similar to the old version. Note that it's now been issued as the Ministry of MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Community, and Local Government. Previously, under the previous administration, it was DLUC, so the Department of Levelling Up. That was an instant change when the new government came into power. So housing, so one of the key things here is housing needs. So quite a lot has been talked about in terms of the housing targets that are imposed on local planning authorities. And it was some surprise when the new NPPF came out that the housing targets were changed considerably based on what's called the standard model. So this is the method for calculating housing targets for each of the authorities. Now, there was some consternation that a lot of the London authorities had their housing targets reduced, and a lot of rural authorities had their targets increased. We'll come back to this in a second. But the reason for this is that the new housing targets are based on things like affordability and existing stock, rather than household projections, which was how it was calculated previously. And there are some subtleties around the removal of sort of caps and additions for local circumstances. But interestingly, if you look at the housing targets in terms of density, actually the picture is how you'd expect. So the denser areas have the more urban areas have the higher density targets as expressed as density, so housing per square mile or whatever, and the rural areas are less dense. One of the controversial things about it was about the new version is that it removes what's called the urban uplift. So when in 2023 the Conservative government added an additional requirement on urban authorities to provide housing, and that's been removed, which is one of the reasons why these targets have come down. Something else that's in the NPPF is that there is a new mandatory 5-year land supply. So regardless of how old local plans are, they must maintain a 5-year land supply. And one of the other commitments that you no doubt will have heard of is that the government is committed to building 1.5 million homes in the first term, which is a hugely ambitious target, which is roughly 370,000 homes per year. Not the 300,000 that was first talked about, acknowledging the fact that in the first year there's going to be a shortfall. But the big but here is that we have not built anywhere near 300,000 homes in this country until the late 1960s, early 70s. Typically around the sort of 150, or about half that since the 80s. So we've got a huge amount of work to do to get anywhere near that figure. And I want to talk about Greenbelt for a second, because obviously these housing targets have put pressure on Greenbelt, and this is a hugely controversial area, and you'll have seen lots of news, particularly from the right-wing press, sort of news items about people getting very excited about the new housing targets and what that means for the countryside. But in reality, if you look at the kind of figures we're talking about, it's really, really tiny. So if you take a typical rural authority, like this one here, Bassetlaw, now they've had a significant uplift in their housing targets. But if you look at that compared to the size of their area, it would require something like a fraction of 1% of the total area. So even though these numbers are increasing significantly, the total area required is tiny. So the idea that we're sort of concreting over the countryside is quite frankly nonsense. Compare that to somewhere like Tower Hamlets. I mean, this is not quite a comparable visual, because in actual fact, in urban areas, we'll be sort of intensifying more widely across the urban area. But that's a comparison. Tower Hamlets has got to find a lot more housing based on the area of the borough. So another big initiative in the new NPPF is this idea of grey belt, and the NPPF includes a definition of what grey belt is, which is new. So this wasn't included in the previous version. So it identifies grey belt as being previously developed land, or land that makes a limited contribution to the 5 green belt purposes. I'll talk about that in a second, but excluding those areas or assets of particular importance, such as areas of great landscape value or national parks and that sort of thing. And there's been lots of stuff about this in the press and on social media, but taking one example, that aerial photograph on the left is actually a piece of green belt in St Albans. There's lots of examples of that. So green belt, to be absolutely clear, is nothing to do with green space. It's nothing to do with landscape quality. It's simply a planning designation to prevent building. And the green belt serves 5 purposes according to the NPPF, and these remain. But the idea is that it's simply there to restrict, to prevent sprawl, suburban sprawl, prevent towns merging into one another, to assist in safeguarding the countryside, preserving the setting of historic towns, and to assist in urban regeneration. So all of these are written into the NPPF. But it's worth saying that even if you were to build 1.5 million homes in one place, that black dot is the amount of space that you need to do it. So the idea that suddenly we're going to be carpeting the countryside in development is nonsense, and we need to hammer that home. That really what we're talking about, even this 1.5 million home figure, is relatively small, although significant. If you fancy reading the new version of the NPPF and commenting on it, I encourage you to do so. It closes, the consultation period closes on the 24th of September at 11:45 p.m. So please do get your comments in before then. That's it. Let me just. That was super quick, and I realized it was sort of quite maybe a little in depth. So maybe we can cover any questions about that now.
That was really, really helpful. I've got a couple of questions for you, Russell, before give people a chance to put something in the chat. I was just thinking sort of about how the broader population thinks about planning. And it's almost as if half the population thinks that planning is there to stop things being built.
Yeah.
And half the population thinks planning system is there to enable things to be built. And I just wondered what your thoughts are about how we overcome this sort of really binary way of looking at the world.
It's a really important point, this, because I mean, let's face it, people only tend to interact with the planning system when somebody is looking at building something close to them. And that, I think, is problematic. Where we should be encouraging people to get involved is at the plan making stage. So the plan making stage is where a council or a unitary authority decides on where development should go, what it should look like, what requirements or what things it wants to impose in terms of things like affordable housing or car parking or all that sort of stuff. That's the strategic plan, and that's the point at which I think we need to encourage much more engagement, because that's where the key decisions are made. But it's very difficult to do that because it's so complicated, and the terminology is impenetrable even to people like me who spend a lot of their time looking at this stuff. And so I think we need to find a way of opening it up and making it much more accessible and interactive and legible for people who are, let's face it, not familiar with a lot of the things that for us are common parlance.
And you quite often see some really good examples of engagement um, at a sort of hyper local level. So some parish councils are absolutely excellent
Yeah,
at this, but we don't seem to have managed to sort of higher up the chain,
yeah.
as it were. Maybe we should just teach plot planning on the national curriculum, and that would be a big help. Um, right, Ros. Okay, this is really interesting. Same question from more or less from Dermot. What should the NPPF say about empty homes? And I wonder whether you could sort of enlarge on that a little
Mm,
bit. I
Well, I
think so many people have seen a situation where, yeah, we're having loads of building, but they're being sold off plan in Hong Kong.
yeah.
There's nothing about this for local people. So how can we help? How can the planning system do something to stop us just building stuff that are in effect banks for
Yeah,
very rich people?
yes, I
yeah.
mean, I've been very passionate about this for some time, as I support a choir called the Choir with No Name, which is for homeless people. And I live in London, I live in Lambeth. I see plenty of homeless people sleeping on the street. And I was struck yesterday by the coverage about domestic violence and the people who are fleeing domestic violence. And yet we have these huge swathes of property in London, swallowing up London and killing it off, basically, because there are schools closing because there are not enough people, and they're turning London into a bunch of safety deposit boxes for very rich people from elsewhere. And I think people are wise to the unfairness of it, and something needs to happen about it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpick there. I mean, I think it is worth saying that that England has one of the lowest empty housing ratios of comparable economies. So, although it is it is an issue, you do need some empty homes in order for a housing economy to work. So people that can move around.
Why?
But because if there's no liquidity in the market, then people can't move because because you end up with very complex chains that just don't that just don't function. But I do accept that there is a problem perhaps with properties being sold, marketed, in Singapore and places, and this sort of safety deposit box in the sky sort of narrative. That is an issue, but the fact is that we simply have not built enough homes. We are somewhere in the region of 4.3 million homes short of where a economy and population of our size should be. And what that means is that people, I mean, one of the interesting things you mentioned there was about schools closing. One of the reasons schools are closing in central London in particular is because families are not starting because we don't have suitable accommodation for them, and young people are being either priced out of the market, or they're unable to start families because they're not able to move up the housing ladder because we simply haven't built enough homes for them.
I've been told that you can't get a mortgage here. It's much easier to get to sell a property abroad than it is to get a mortgage. I couldn't afford a mortgage anyway.
Yeah. That may well be true. Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily something that the NPPF should be mandating, because obviously we're talking about London specifically, and the NPPF is a national policy, and local councils are able to bring in planning policies which restrict those kind of things if they want to. So the NPPF sort of sets the framework, and local planning policies can start to, because obviously if you're in Northern England or somewhere where you've got a surplus of housing, it's a slightly different condition. So I'm not sure the NPPF should necessarily be doing that, but local councils absolutely should be. But also big problem is things like Airbnbs and short-term lets and stuff. So that really is an issue. But I think that's probably falling outside the scope of the NPPF.
Don't let's get started on Airbnb because this will completely derail everything. Let's ban it. Right, some more questions here. Why does the NPPF not refer to all new flats being common hold?
Again, I'm not sure that's within the scope of the plan. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a planning related function. I think there are there are other pieces of legislation that would control that perhaps should promote different forms of ownership and tenure.
So Alex says he'd be interested to know what Russell thinks about the grey belt and how this might help with the NPPF and housing delivery.
I mean,
is
grey
it a
belts.
gimmick or is it a
Well,
thing?
actually, no. I'm not sure it is a gimmick actually, and I think what's interesting is what the definition itself has done has sort of shifted the Overton window slightly around discussions about the green belt, partly because there is this massive misconception about what green belt is what it's for, what its function is, and what it looks like. And it's true to say that there are huge areas, the example I showed, there are huge areas of the green belt that are just not green. They don't function as leisure space or agriculture or anything. But development is prohibited there. So I think that just the general term grey belt is quite helpful in moving the discussion. I mean, I've seen some wildly varying estimates as to what's included in grey belt. I mean, personally, I suspect perhaps 1.5 to 2% of existing green belt might be grey belt. Litchfield, the planning consultancy, recently published a piece of work where they suggested it might be between 15 and 20%. Now, bearing in mind that London's green belt alone stretches from Guildford, Godalming to the North Sea, is 5 times the size of London. The green belt is ginormous. So 15 or 20% of that would basically be a new London. So I think that's probably a little bit optimistic. But I do think that it's helping us have a more sensible conversation about what greenbelt should be doing.
Getting technical now from Alex. How do design codes fit in with the NPPF? Maybe worth doing a quick explainer of design codes.
Okay.
About 60 seconds. Go.
So design codes are a way of a local planning authority establishing some parameters around what new development might look like. And it wouldn't be part of their local plan. It wouldn't be part of their planning policy. It would probably exist as what's called something like a supplementary planning document, supplementary design guide. But essentially, a design code can set out parameters, how tall buildings should be, what they might. I mean, you can make them very tight or very loose depending on your requirements or how big the area that you're covering. But so how big windows might be, what materials you might use, height, massing, all of that sort of stuff. So they are a sort of supplementary piece of policy that can be introduced in parallel to the local plan.
Yeah, less than 60 seconds. Well done, you. So this is interesting from Sheila, and I think if we look over the last probably 20 years, often we see solutions that work in the London housing market imposed upon the country as a whole, which isn't necessarily good for anyone except London. So we've got Sheila saying, I'm really concerned about the revised NPPF setting higher targets and higher densities, or is it universal densities when we don't need huge numbers of new homes in the northeast and definitely do not need greater densities?
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true. The point I tried to make in my presentation, perhaps ineloquently, but you know, actually the numbers we're talking about are relatively small relative to the size of the authorities. So we're not really talking about density in the same way that we might be in cities. And you know, and I am sort of aware of people's nervousness around about a green belt release, and that's going to have to form some part of the solution to housing. But I think if you look at and I've done a mapping exercise, those maps I showed, I've done that for all of England's planning authorities. Actually, the amount of green space, even if you were to build entirely in green space, which isn't the intention, actually it's a very, very small area that you'd need to do so. So I think people probably don't quite understand the scale involved.
Do you think people understand the difference between green space and the green belt?
No, we know they don't. I think there's there's research done. In fact, I read some last year that if you do a survey of the general public and ask them to estimate how much of England is built on, typically they'll say it's between 30 and 40%. Actually, it's 9% if you include domestic gardens and 4% if you exclude domestic gardens. So, England is not very densely developed whatsoever. But it's if you spend a lot of time looking at maps like I do, you can you can appreciate this, but that's not the same as sort of living in a town and seeing development around you and thinking that there's a lot coming forward.
And so a final question, because I think we're going to go over to Alex in a minute. It feels a little bit like we have it. Well, we're waiting to see what's going to be in the spending review, but it feels like we've got all our eggs in the planning basket.
Yeah.
To me, you can't solve a housing crisis merely by, changing the planning system.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, it's a help. It should be an enabler, but there's an awful lot of other things that I think we also need to do. So I'd like your view on that, and then we'll come back to you in 5 years' time. Are we going to hit 1.5 million, or should we have said 3 million in 10 years?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think the certainly planning has a lot to do with it, because the planning system, besides everything else, the planning system is just way too unpredictable, and one of the reasons we have a monopoly of large volume house builders is because they can work with the existing planning system and they can hedge their bets. So like venture capitalists, they can hedge their bets on different sites. Whereas if you're a small scale developer, and our small developer industry has collapsed in the last 20 years or so, if you're a small developer and you're just focusing on one site and you've bought it and you're paying interest on the land acquisition and fees and all that sort of stuff, if your planning decision is refused or delayed by months, that can turn a project from a slight profit into a significant loss. And what we need to be doing is finding ways, and design codes are part of this, finding ways to make the planning system itself much more predictable, because we need to reinvigorate our small house builders, and with that will reinvigorate local economies because they tend to rely on the local supply chain. So I'm a big fan of making it much more predictable. I really worry about the 1.5 million home target. I think the government will be extremely harshly judged if it fails to get close to that figure. And make no mistake, we are not going to do that by building new towns in the countryside. That's a 5 to 10 year plan at best.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We've got loads more questions in the chat, but I think they will be picked up. A lot of them look suitable to be picked up by the panel later on. So it's just for me to say a massive thank you to Russell for that contribution.
Thank you.
And that was really interesting. And I'm going to hand over, I think, now to Alex.
Yes, you are. Thank you, Alison, and thank you to Russell for a fantastic presentation. I think we wanted to kind of have a bit of an interactive element of this event because we're aware that we bring in a lot of fantastic expertise into these events, but also that we have a lot of fantastic expertise within Labour Housing Group and within the housing sector at large about planning. And so we kind of wanted to open up to the audience a little bit and to talk to you guys about what your experiences of planning have been, what you would like to see changed in the planning system, and how you think that the new NPPF could really help with this. So this is kind of really a cast out to anybody who wants to talk to this. Anything which you guys will mention can get included in our little write-up. It won't be attributed to you by name, but we'll kind of mention that this was mentioned in the discussion and this is a priority for Labour Housing Group members. So more than happy to give people a couple of minutes to think about it, or to kind of jump straight in as if anybody wants to kind of put their hands up and we can get right into it. And I'm probably quite happy to have this kind of an open room discussion so people can kind of put hands up, go into it when they want to, and go from there. Hi, Sheila.
I'll jump in because I've just been reading the consultation document, so there's 2 or 3 things that I feel quite strongly about. I'll just come back to the issue about density. What the NPPF document says is that we propose to strengthen expectations that plans should promote an uplift in density in urban areas. And my view is, as I've said, is that uplift, even though Russell says it would be quite small, I don't believe we need an uplift in density in the northeast. And funnily enough, I had that conversation with people from the office of the Deputy Prime Minister in the last Labour government, who were trying to say we should have the same thing everywhere. Everywhere we need new houses, and everywhere we need more new houses. And I just do not believe in some parts of the northeast that we need it at all. We certainly don't need an increase in density, and you can increase the provision of housing by using grey belt and brownfield without vastly increasing density. I have the same sort of anxiety about increasing the targets, and I think this is something that I really need to study quite a lot more. But I personally don't think we need very many more new houses for everybody in the northeast. What we need is genuinely affordable, i.e. social housing. And in my local authority, Borough, that is what the housing strategy says that they discovered from their consultation. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that there is an assumption in the document of supporting sustainable development, supporting community-led housing, and supporting development of housing for special needs. And I think that all of those things are very much to be welcomed.
Thank you for your contribution there, Sheila. And I definitely think that, so in the work which I do at work in the Housing Forum, we're seeing a lot of kind of issues around sort of house building in certain sort of what you might describe sort of weaker housing markets where there isn't that kind of massive demand crunch. And actually that, like in some places, particularly in the Northeast, for instance, it's actually more expensive to build homes than it is to sell them right now. So definitely worth having that on board, and we'll have that in the overall document. Dermot, over to you. Thank you for joining the conversation. You need to unmute.
The previous government allowed the freehold owners of blocks of flats to build 2 extra stories on top of blocks without planning permission. And this prevents leaseholders who want to have solar panels on their roof. They have to go and apply for permission from the freeholder, and they may have to pay for such permission. But also the freeholder is going to be reluctant to grant permission if they can build 2 stories on top of the blocks without planning permission. Should the NPF change this? It seems to be unfair for leaseholders.
That sounds really interesting. I haven't come across it at all. Also, if I have a look over here, it's because I'm typing at the same time as listening to you guys. But Thank you for contributing that. And actually, I'll follow up with you after that because that sounds like a really interesting sort of facet of that. I'm not sure if anybody who's kind of more planning expert can chime in on that in particular, but that sounds like a really sort of interesting issue to kind of contribute to when there is this kind of need to sort of build more sustainably, and often that can involve kind of like mansard roof, extra stories, but sort of that clash versus having more sustainable housing in a kind of green sense as well. So that's really interesting. Thank you, Dermot.
Alex, can I just come in on that one? Just
oh yes, Russell,
because that is really interesting. Because actually the upward extension is possible through permitted development. So it actually sits outside the planning system because it's permitted development, and that similarly. Converting offices into residential is also permitted development, so sits outside the sort of conventional planning system. And I've not heard any indication thus far that there is an intention to roll back some of those permitted development rights. Others here might have heard something, but as far as I'm aware at the moment, that's not part of the plan, but it may change.
Yeah, I haven't seen much on permitted development orders in the NPPF so far, but I will have an ask around. That sounds really interesting. Alex Cowley, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. So every time I go on a call nowadays, there's always another Alex on these. So yeah,
there are too many of them. I'm not sure why.
Good to see. There's a fellow Alex on the call. Yeah, yeah. So I think from my point of view, in terms of the NPPF and kind of what it needs to do. It's interesting with the NPPF because it is, as Russell was saying, it's a national policy document, and yet so much, of course, of housing delivery comes from local plans and local authorities. And from my experience working in the planning sector, the issue seems to be around that communication, firstly between developers and local authorities, being able to sort of get local plans through. And then just the resources as well regarding actual planners in the public sector. And I mean, obviously the issue there is, of course, is that people will go, well, I worked in the public sector for a bit, I sort of cut my teeth and then I'll go to the private sector. So there sort of needs to be, I think, probably more incentive to try to keep people, planners in the public sector, and whatever way that is, it's probably above my pay grade to know that, but that's an important part. But I think in order to do that, in order to kind of ensure housing delivery, especially with any new NPPF, there needs to be better communication between local authorities and developers around what could be provided. Hence why my comment about the grey belt, actually, which is a really important, and Russell hit the nail completely on the head on that point, because it's my position as well, is that Greenbelt has been poorly characterized of what it actually is. I mean, technically there are towns in the Greenbelt, you know, but you wouldn't count them as like a rolling field. So that kind of thing, again, needs to be sort of properly thought out, and I think not demystified, get rid of the myth basically around it. So yeah, the kind of my thoughts. Any NPPF, and speaking to people in the industry, any NPPF needs to kind of provide that clarity, I think, and that relationship needs to be better. And I think it can be better as well. I think developers are looking to have conversations with local government. It has got to that stage now in housing delivery where that needs, you know, they are basically willing to do that, because otherwise nothing will happen, and that doesn't help them either.
That's brilliant. Thank you for your contribution there. Actually, I'm going to put a document in the chat, which is something from my current organisation that I work for, the Housing Forum. We did some work recently on how sort of the planning profession can be supported, particularly in that kind of element of keeping that retention, that recruitment, because, yeah, we're seeing the exact same issue among our local authority members of huge issues retaining planners because of austerity, essentially, and what the Conservatives have done for the last 14 years of draining local authorities dry. So really appreciate your contributions there, and we'll be sure to include it into the document. Great to have some of your hands up. Let's go. So on my screen, we've got Jackie, then Leanne, then Alison, and we'll keep them going down from there.
Thanks. Yes, I have had a look at the consultation, and the things that concerns me, and I probably should say I'm not by any means a planning expert, but I have raised my concerns with Bob Colnut, who has shared them, and that relates to some really good proposals, but in the small print it says subject to viability. And it seems to me that the viability assessments in the past have been a big loophole for the big developers to jump through, and reinforces the case that they try to make, that they can only afford to build a very small percentage of social housing on their development sites. And even what they originally promised gets whittled down further and ends up being maybe 70% low cost home ownership as opposed to social rented, which in key areas we're absolutely desperate for more social rented housing. So I just wondered what we can do about that, how we can improve viability assessments so that they provide the basis to prevent developers appealing against decisions, or if they do, having a robust local authority argument that could actually see them off, even if it has to go to court.
That's a really great question. And I suspect that there are people on the school who can answer it better than me, but I'll give it a crack first. I'm aware that CPO powers are really helpful here, particularly for local authorities trying to deliver social homes. And what Matt Pennycook has done over the last couple of months in changing the regulation around CPO so that it can be used to kind of get away from this idea of hope value of how much land might be worth after developed, so that you can actually buy land at a lower price for things in the public interest can be of use. But one particular issue the local authorities face, in my experience at least, is that they don't sort of have the legal confidence to take landowners to court around this. So also sort of local authorities need stronger sort of legal protections and legal assurances within this. But I'm more than happy to get any other input on that if anyone really wants to kind of chip in, because viability is so tremendously complex, and it'd be great to hear more from anyone else in the call about that if we have any kind of other expertise.
Alex, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but there is obviously a suggestion in the NPPF that any grey belt development would also need to provide infrastructure and 50% affordable housing, again subject to viability. So that is a tricky area that I think is I don't have the answer to, but it is a big issue. Also, there's a sort of secondary related big issue at the moment, that the way that a lot of affordable housing is delivered by private developers is what's called Section 106, where there is a legal obligation for them to bring on board a housing association, usually a registered provider, but actually the registered providers are exiting the market and are not buying the housing. So there are developers there with affordable housing that they can't do anything with it.
Yeah, it's a massive issue. And again, I think I've seen issues. I think affordable housing starts in London have massively plummeted in the last year, and that's in part because of lack of local authority financing. Anyway, I won't take any more time with me chatting because everyone else here is far more interesting. So, Leanne, let's go over to you.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm here representing a Don't Waste Buildings. It's we're not political, but we have people from right across the built environment. So developers, architects, engineers, policymakers, all sorts of people. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the chat later with sort of I'm the convener, which to our LinkedIn page, where you can see our recommendations for changes to the NPPF. And it's not necessarily all about housing, but it's worth putting that in, because there's a lot of people, the Empty Homes group are very keen to make sure that government uses existing homes as a presumption of planning and other buildings. So I'll just read it out. This has been put together by greater minds than me, but it's basically in both making plans and determining planning applications, local planning authorities should strive to promote radical reductions in upfront carbon impact of construction. Authorities should therefore adopt a strong presumption in favour of developments that substantially reuse and refurbish existing buildings and structures, and demonstrate significant use of reclaimed and low carbon materials. So it should adopt a presumption against demolishing buildings and structures capable of refurbishment. It goes on further, but that's the paraphrase. So it'd be good if that was, and it doesn't. Our response to the NPPF goes beyond housing, but it is relevant to housing as well. So thanks very much for
Thank you. Yes.
letting me put that across.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Liam. There's a really interesting paper by the Green Alliance on kind of like at what point it is appropriate to do demolition, because obviously it's so contentious, and there is this whole issue of sort of carbon budgets as well. I guess separate to that, there's the elements of the building regs and things like the Future Home Standard coming in that will significantly reduce emissions from the built environment, largely because of operational carbon. So there's sort of a lot of hope there, I think, right now, which is really great. And it'll be great to see what comes out of that as well, as it goes in. Anyway, Alison, over to you.
So a random group of things really. One is on permitted development, and maybe that's something we could look at Labour Housing Group anyway, because we are building benefit farms, we're building miserable, inappropriate places where nobody can lead a good life. And they're just farms to make money for some not very nice people. If a proportion of 1.5 million is going to be those, then that is not a victory. That is not something to be celebrated. So I think there's a discussion to be had around there. There's all sorts of things that sort of sit in conflict with one another. So if we're looking at just listening with great interest to what Leanne was saying and sort of nodding along, and then thinking, yeah, but we've got the oldest housing stock in Europe. That's really, really, really problematic. We've got a lot of homes that were put up really badly and they're not fit for purpose. And actually, we've not got a strategy for dealing with that. And I think when we're going to use this document to kickstart building, and that's absolutely great, but we need to, we've lost the beauty thing, and that's fine because that was all very problematic. But I think at some point we've got to make sure that we are not just chasing numbers, that actually we're chasing quality along the way. That is also sustainable. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I completely agree, and I'm completely on board with building houses and homes for people. I think we're very worried that in the jump to get them done, they're going to be built badly, and so and we've got this crisis with the climate. We've also got the crisis with housing, so we've got to make sure that they're built well and up to standard, not only for now, for the future. And that's a big ask. So we need to put pressure. I mean, I'm slightly nervous about the link up with Homes England and Barrett's. That's a personal view, and I think we need to make sure that the quality of what comes out is we don't want to be sitting here in 50 years' time saying, look at that rubbish we put up.
Final point was just to say on viability assessments, there's a really, really old article that Oliver Wainwright wrote probably about 10 years ago on the dark arts of the developers. Sorry for all you developers out there, but it's really interested on viability assessment. So I'd recommend that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We've got 10 minutes left. I think let's go to our last two question askers of Heather and Roz, and then we'll go on to our panel discussion from there. And Bob just getting in before time runs out. It's those three then. So Heather, then Roz, then Bob. Thank you.
I just very quickly, I just want to say that I agree with everything that Jackie and other people have said about viability. I chair planning committee in Camden, so central London. So you can imagine that developers tell us constantly that the sites they're going to build on are not viable. It's bizarre because they tell us they're not viable even if they don't provide affordable housing, but they still seem to go ahead and want to go ahead with building, except sometimes they don't. And that is the other problem that I just would love to be able to cure. I know it's an issue in London. I suspect it's an issue in other places. I can think of a number of sites that have had at least 3 different planning permissions on them, or they've got a planning permission and it just doesn't get built. And then the next time round they come back and there's going to be less affordable housing on it and whatever. And, you know, and the idea that getting planning permission is what is stopping people building, when I know that they sit on sites where they've got planning permission. And I really wish we could do something about that. And I'm also very, I am very worried about standards, because I think there is certainly from some people there is a push to have lower standards, to allow lower standards, because lowest, you know, the higher standards are what are causing the problems, and that's why the viability doesn't work. And you know that we should be looking at getting rid of things like dual aspect requirements, you know, and I just think that, you know, it's a very, very rocky road if what we're talking about is building slums for the future and properties that people really can't live kind of proper lives in. So that was kind of quickly my thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Heather. And looking forward to seeing you in the debate in a second. Over to Ros again.
Yeah, just to say, with the development, does the framework talk about the need to have an adequate infrastructure to develop, you know, to support any new housing developments like GP surgeries, schools, whatever, you know, that kind of thing?
I think that's a particular focus of the grey belt stuff. Russ might want to chime in here as well, but I think that's one of Labour's 5 golden rules for any grey belt development, is that it does have that kind of proper infrastructure around it as well. That's
correct. Yeah, that's correct. I think it's very, very conscious of the fact that we don't want to be building sort of car-dependent sprawl on the edge of towns, that there's no, you know, shops or anything. That's a big focus.
Just the other thing is that the word affordable housing has very little credibility in London anyway, because it refers to people being what's referred to as affordable isn't affordable for most people, you know, and it's a nonsense really. I think they need another term or something. I'm not sure what, but it's a nonsense.
Yeah, definitely. As a private renter in London, couldn't agree more. Anyway, Bob, close us out, shall you? And we've lost Bob. I think you need to unmute. Give us a second. Bob.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, I apologise, I was late and I probably missed some of the contributions that were already being made about viability. I know that Jackie probably raised it, Heather raised it, other people probably raised it, but I feel it is so fundamentally problematic that after all the campaigning that's been done to try to do something about taking the viability out of planning decisions, we find it still in the revised NPPF in paragraph 59. And I think it's really, really important that people look at paragraph 59 and make quite sure that we either delete the entire paragraph or this critical sentence which says, and I quote, "It is up to the applicant to demonstrate whether particular circumstances justify the need for a viability assessment at the application stage." Now, it's precisely that policy that's caused the havoc that people are talking about in relation to the way in which local plan policies on affordable housing have been undermined. And it's absolutely fundamental after all this campaigning that Labour makes sure that that sentence is removed and possibly the entire paragraph. I mean, why is it even in there? This is so critical because otherwise we're going to get more housing, but no guarantee there's going to be affordable housing. In fact, the game will be played like the developers and landowners did last time, which is to force down the levels of affordable housing through Section 106. So that has to go. I don't know what others think, but I feel that's absolutely fundamental, or we're just moving not forward at all. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Bob. And I'm going to quickly put in a link into the chat, which is for a Google form. So if you feel like you haven't had a chance to speak, or if you want to add something to what you've already said, or if you want to provide any more resources for us to check in our response to this, please just fill in that. I'll have a look at that and I will add it into our report coming forward from this event. So now it's time to turn to our panel discussion featuring some wonderful experts from across the housing sector. So first off, we've got Heather Johnson, who's our chair, who, sorry, had a little chat, but sort of head of planning committee at London Borough of Camden, fantastic Labour housing group vice chair and massive housing expert who I can never ever compete with. We've got Tom Chance, who is chief executive of the Community Land Trusts here, who can talk about that kind of SME perspective and how we can get a much more diverse set of people in the built environment producing the homes we need. Got Rachael Williamson, who's head of policy and practice at the Chartered Institute of Housing, who works with lots of kind of housing associations providing affordable housing. And last but not least, we have Shama Tatler, who is cabinet member for planning, regeneration and growth at the London Borough of Brent, who has been delivering a whole bunch of housing across London. So over to the four of you.
Hi, well, I'm not planning really to say very much, but rather to sort of chair it. I think I'll let the other speakers go first. And if people can put any questions they have into the chat, because we haven't got a lot of time, but we can maybe pick up some questions or comments from the chat. So shall we start with, let's start with Rachael.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everybody. Great to be with you. And yeah, as Alex said, I'm head of policy and external affairs here at CIH. I know we've done quite a lot of work with Labour Housing Group. So thank you, all of you, for your support and input. And great to see some active CIH members on the call as well. I just caveat what I will say when I say I'm not a planning expert. There'll be people on the call that know far more about the technicalities of the NPPF than I do, but I can kind of talk through, I suppose, where we're at in terms of our headline thoughts, having done a lot of member engagement, and really interested to hear what you'll want to share. And I've been making notes as people have been speaking. I guess, I mean, just to echo a lot of what's been said already, and Alison's point around can't solve the housing crisis with planning reform, but it's a start. I guess that's where we're starting from. So I'm just holding the pen at the moment on our draft response, and the deadline is looming. And we're sort of starting by saying, well, overall, we welcome it. It's absolutely right direction. But planning is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting here, and we absolutely want to make the point about the other stuff that's needed around it, around boosting capacity, around investment. So, you know, others have already set out really clearly the argument that the last time we built anywhere close to the scale we're talking about was in the 1970s, when government put a huge amount of investment in terms of land, capacity, money into helping local authorities. So I know Alex introduced me with the sort of housing association angle, and I don't want to step on others' toes, but obviously local authorities have got a huge role to play in this. And thinking about, you know, the new capacity outlined already, you know, 300 new planning officers, it's good, but it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it, when we look at what's needed and the skills needed. So we will absolutely be welcoming in a headline sense, but wanting to say there's an awful lot of other stuff needed here, and hoping that the budget on the 30th of October and the spending review that follows will recognise that. And obviously there's a tension there when I understand the government setting its stall out and managing expectations down, but I think as a sector, we want to be saying very, very clearly, there is no way this is going to happen unless there is a serious amount of investment in the widest sense. On a few specific points, I think we'll be looking to bring out as well, and there's a huge amount of questions. If you've not seen the consultation yet, there's 106. We're not certainly going to try and answer every single one, but there's a lot there and it gets very technical. But we will be making the points around social housing. As others have said, it needs to play a really, really strong role here. It's a missed opportunity if we don't get that in there. And as said, and just, you know, what affordable means to people now is so messed up, isn't it? So we want to look at the opportunities through the NPPF to really drill into what does affordable mean, how is that defined, looking at local income. We want to make sure that housing need reflects unmet need, housing formation that might be stalled, the role of supported housing, looking at understanding the interplay with temporary accommodation, which is obviously absolutely huge. So making sure that it's taking into account the pressures in the system there. We'll be welcoming the review of Greenbelt. Lots of this we called for in our housing strategy that we put out before the election. So, you know, recognise that there's a bit of myth busting, I think, to do around that, and there's a role for all of us, I suppose, in how we talk about it. I think good to see local plans. You know, and we heard the stat earlier, only 1 in 5 have currently got one, but to get there, we're going to need a lot of capacity support. It's not that people are sitting around thinking, let's not bother having a local plan. There's a lot of work to do to get there, but land supply has got to, you know, has got a huge role to play. And of course, government has a lot of land. So there's local authorities identifying what land might be in their area looking ahead, but government's got a job to do. And obviously the new towns will play a big role in that. And we're waiting to see more detail on it. What else is worth highlighting? I think infrastructure comes through loud and clear through all of it. So homes and building, creating new healthy places, of course, is so much more than the bricks and mortar of existing homes. There's all the infrastructure that goes around it, with schools and transport connections, and very much looking across to the government's commitments on net zero and sustainable development, being really clear on well, how's that going to work then, the skills that are needed to make that happen, and the money that's going to have to go into it to make it happen. There's a massive opportunity here, I think, here to really, I guess, looking at the politics of it, to create a bit of sense of hope and vision. It's been a bit gloomy so far, hasn't it? I think this is an opportunity to say, look, what do we want to be as a nation? Home is absolutely central to people building a foundation in their life. I don't need to tell you guys that, you know it. So, you know, this is an opportunity as a country, if we can look at some of the technicalities maybe around how public debt is currently accounted for, and CIH has done a bit of work looking at that around the HRA and the things that are needed to just you know, turn things around a little bit so we can find the money. Obviously work in partnership. I think thinking innovatively and creatively, and a really good report from Resolution Foundation out last week looking at, you know, what we've got is a good start, but we could go a lot further. And I guess the challenges others have said is that, you know, politically, rightly or wrongly, the government has set its stall out now with this 1.5 million in the next 5 years. And actually not a lot's going to happen in the first year. It takes a long time to get shovels in the ground. It'll be a while before we see ministers with a hard hat on a site showing lots of new homes being built. So there's a, you know, they're going to have to deliver way more than 300,000 a year from year 2 to get anywhere close to this. But there's a danger that we fall into kind of doom-mongery already, I think, with it's all so difficult. So I think stepping back and thinking, well, look, it is the right thing to do to build more homes, but they've got to be the right homes in the right places that people can afford. And we've got to be building homes that are fit for the future. There's too many examples, and actually Alison shared one just on LinkedIn earlier, of homes being built now that are just not good enough. There's so many problems with them because the developers creating them and then running off, and no one's there to deliver on the long term, and often, you know, social housing providers are left holding the baby, so to speak. So I think being really clear from government, from that framework, some of which will come through in the infrastructure and planning bill, around what's expected, with some clear enforcement where people are not delivering as they should be, and an opportunity to really you know, create the homes and the society that we want, because it speaks to so many issues around inequality, doesn't it? And I think it's a massive opportunity to look at, as I guess the Chancellor set out in her first speech, housing as a driver for growth. So before we disappear off into the technicalities of NPPF, I guess just here's what I would do, and I say this as a non-planning expert, is to step back and think, what are we trying to do? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And let's welcome what we can welcome and point to the things that need tweaking. But I think it's a really good start. I hope that we'll see the planning and infrastructure bill soon. I hope we'll get a bit more information on the new towns, and obviously the task force is set up. Good to see government launching the task force to look at stalled sites, but opportunities to deal with other things as well around that, like we've talked about permitted development rights. Completely agree with what Alison said on this sort of the problem area we're seeing now, and we're flagging that in our response, that we want to hear what the government's going to say on it, and an opportunity to also address issues we've all been waiting for a long time around accessible homes. So I better stop there, otherwise no one will have a chance to say anything else. But there's my starter for 10. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rachel. There was a lot in there. I'm going to have to look at the recording of it again so I can remember what you said, because there was more than I could even take notes of. I gave up even trying to do that. So let me bring in Tom straight away then. Tom, do you want to give us your ideas? And then I'll go, and after Shama, I'll go through what's in the chat or any questions or anything. Okay.
Okay, thanks. So I was asked to talk about small builders, and I recently wrote a piece for the Red Brick blog on this. So I'll talk about some of the stuff in that blog. Just to introduce myself, so I head up the Community Land Trust Network. We're a network of about 360 community-led developers across England and Wales that are trying to either bring empty buildings back into use or build new homes and workspace and so on to meet local needs. And they're predominantly focused actually on social housing as the main thing that CLTs are building around the country. And forms of community-led development like that, and individual households also commissioning their own homes or working with a house builder or customizing homes from a house builder in the UK are a tiny part of our market. So about 6%, 6 to 7% of homes each year are built that way here. Across other similar European or North American countries, it's more like 40% of house building. And in some places, it's the majority of housing is built that way. And you might have read over the summer, there's been a flurry of interest in places like Vienna with a different sort of model of social housing, which is very much this community-led model. And then SMEs, like small and medium-sized private house builders, have also got quite a small market share in the UK. It's now about 10%. Again, look back in our history, only 40 years ago, that would have been around 40% and even higher if you go further back. The great house building boom in the 30s was really led by small builders. And gradually, these different sorts of approaches have been squeezed out in a system that is really now geared around the needs of volume house builders. And Russell has already spoken a bit about this, but just to recap, the reason that's a problem is that it means that we build less, we build more slowly, we build lower quality, we get less affordability, it's less popular with communities. And the Competition and Markets Authority, among others, have kind of many people have studied what role the planning system plays in this. And it is not that the planning system is asking too much. And we categorically reject the idea that what you should do is remove requirements for affordable housing and all these other burdens to help house builders. And within that different sort of diversity of providers, there might be a bit of disagreement on that. So, for example, the Small Builders Lobby often says for small sites, you shouldn't require affordable housing. Whereas the Community Land Trust Network, we disagree because that cuts out a key source of much needed affordable housing, especially in small towns or rural areas where you might find most development happening on small sites and you're not getting any social housing out of it. But the things we would all agree on are fundamental problems with the planning system. So one is the cost and complexity, which has grown and grown and grown over the years. And in the UK, we put all that complexity onto the applicant rather than the planning authority thinking it all through upstream. So it now costs, if you're trying to build, say, 10 social homes in your community, it will cost you about £150,000 to navigate the planning system. And per home, it's about 2 or 3 times as expensive for a small builder compared to a volume builder because you don't get the economies of scale. And that has massively increased over the last 10 or 15 years. There are also problems with delays. So I was just today hearing from a CLT in the southwest. It's trying to build 6 social rented homes for its village. They've been stuck in the planning system for 2.5 years because of nutrient neutrality rules. And again, in the media, you'll see stuff around nutrient neutrality as being greedy developers trying to pollute the waterways. This is a community trying to find a way of building 6 social rented homes in their community. And those, on average, we have found CLTs are taking over a year to get a decision on something that should be taking a matter of weeks. And then the final issue is uncertainty, which Russell mentioned. And again, a recent example we had of a CLT in Croydon that had actually been awarded a piece of land by the council when it was a Labour council, worked intensively over years with the local community, had a representative group of local people designing the scheme, lots of discussion with council officers, and eventually they've just been refused planning by a council officer who decided the balconies were slightly wrongly designed and the roof didn't fit the local area. Took no account in their decision of the fact that it would be 100% affordable housing on a small site in Croydon. And that means that CLT has now spent the best part of £150,000 and got refused and is going to have to appeal it. The only way you can navigate the system is either to come in with big, deep pockets or to get grant. And so community land trusts, co-housing co-ops have in recent years been very dependent on stop-start grant programs to navigate the planning system. Once you overcome that, the ability to meet all the requirements, and we welcome some of the stuff that's been discussed here today around tighter definitions of affordability, better requirements to deal with upfront carbon emissions, all that stuff, like you can navigate, you can deal with that. Communities want to build high quality stuff. In terms of what the NPPF is consulting on at the moment, a lot of that stuff isn't really being considered yet, although I raised it at a round table with the Minister yesterday. And there's maybe the planning and infrastructure bill could address some of these more fundamental problems with the system. One thing it is raising is the small sites policy. So the NPPF has a policy that says at least 10% of house building should be coming forward on small sites, and local planning authorities should be trying to allocate small sites for that. Well, most don't allocate that much, and anyway 10% is just the existing very small market share, so it doesn't really help rectify the situation. For council, it takes a lot of resource to put lots of work into lots of small sites, whereas they could more easily put the work into getting one big site they sell off to a volume developer, and that meets their housing requirement. And in large sites in the UK, we just do them all with one builder mostly, whereas in the rest of Europe, you'll find what happens is the council is effectively buying that land. It does the master planning, it breaks it up into lots of parcels, and it sells it to different local builders, to co-ops, to community groups, to self-builders, and so on. And we could do that, and Oliver Letwin some years ago was tasked by the government with reviewing how this all works and made various recommendations, and that just hasn't been implemented. So there's a lot the government could do with the small sites policy to really give it teeth and to ensure that many more opportunities for smaller builders on small sites. In the meantime, one very simple thing we've got, which we managed to get into the NPPF in December and we want improved, is an exception policy. So there's a long-standing policy called rural exception sites, which communities have used to build lots of affordable housing in rural areas, where if you're providing 100% affordable housing on the edge of a village to meet local need, you can get permission when no one else would. And that basically sets a land value that's much, much lower. It's closer to its existing use for farming than full residential value. But that sort of mechanism isn't available in towns or cities. We managed to get something called the community-led exception site policy, which has the principle that if you're a community-led organisation, you're meeting local needs, then in principle you should get permission for your development, which would give you less risk and more access to land at good values with it, like on the edges of towns and within towns and cities. And we need that policy reformed and improved. So there's ways that the NPPF could give advantages to sorts of developers and sorts of development that better meet local needs. And then what we also need to see is a wider reform of the planning system to get away from this monopoly of the large volume builders and get a more diverse range of supply into the system. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. That was also very, very interesting. Shall we move quickly on, and last but not least, Shama, if you want to speak, then we might have a bit of time for some questions and answers afterwards.
Thanks, Heather. And Tom, stuff that you said was absolutely fascinating, and a lot of actually stuff that I think actually genuinely needs to be considered if we're going to have housing as a wider growth element for across the economy, not just volume builders. And the issue of land value is something that really is particularly an issue. But I think in terms of the question for tonight about the NPPF, so in Brent, just to give everybody a bit of context, since Liz Truss's disastrous budget, our temporary accommodation needs have skyrocketed. So we're getting between 120 to 150 families a week households presenting homeless to us at Civic Centre, and we obviously having to find homes for them. Our council housing waiting list has gone to like 30,000 households now. For a borough our size, that's extraordinary. And in terms of council resource, it's meant that we've had to put an additional £16 million in-year overspend just on temporary accommodation, because the temporary accommodation costs, we don't recover everything from the government that it costs to house people that are in temporary accommodation. And that's a wider issue with the housing market, because landlords are exiting the market for various reasons. Partly mortgages have gone up, cost of building, and so on, and so on. So there's a huge issue around temporary accommodation, which I know has been sort of mentioned, and that's sort of just giving you the context of a borough that is actively, pro-housing, that does look at development. In terms of the NPPF, for us in Brent, a lot of the changes that are proposed won't be huge drastic changes for us, because we're actually doing a lot of the things that the NPPF are actually doing. And so we've got the powers within locally that we think that we can still build. But what I would love to see come forward actually in terms of kind of how we support good development, I think is around infrastructure. and the obligations on public sector partners to make sure that the infrastructure is delivered. Some of the experiences we've had in Brent is that we've secured medical centres, schools, transport improvements through the planning system because we've geared our planning system to work that way in Brent. But it takes then the public sector partner years for that to come to fruition. So actually, what we actually need is an obligation for the NPPF, or whether it's whoever is the department of government, to make sure that the obligation on the estates team, whether it's the NHS or it's transport, to make sure that the infrastructure is delivered. So there's an element there. The other thing that I think the NPPF or kind of planning reform generally needs to look at is housing delivery test. So at the moment, the housing delivery test and the penalties sit with the local authority. Now, local authorities will do all it can if they're good to kind of get things over line in terms of planning permission, but actually delivering the housing is going to be the key question here. So you can put all the resource into getting a planning system that works to get the planning permission, but actually delivery and who's accountable for the actual delivery and spades in the ground to stop that speculative planning permissions seeking, or build it or build it or lose it kind of element. Do we need to have a stick and carrot approach to make sure the delivery works? So they're the two areas that I think actually need to be addressed as well, in terms of infrastructure and who's accountable for the delivery. I think there's other areas I think would be really important that I think the housing minister needs to be looking at. And personally, I think we need a housing and infrastructure department or Secretary of State for housing and infrastructure together, because actually the issues that I think been mentioned on the call about density or need actually coincides with infrastructure. So if an area hasn't got infrastructure, you're not going to create the demand for the need, whether it's jobs, whether it's transport or so on. Planning consents are time limited for 4 years, but I think in the crisis that we've got at the moment, it needs to be much shorter. So I think planning consents could be shorter in that. I do think the planning reforms will start to help SMEs and smaller builders. My dad's a smaller builder, and the planning system is very, very risky. And actually the cost of the planning, so hopefully the reforms will de-risk it for smaller developers and for local economies, for community wealth building, that hopefully will kickstart some local economy and cyclical kind of economic drive. In terms of viability and quality, I think this is two really important questions here. I would love to see a move for building regs to move away from independent assessments and bring it back in-house to councils, where there's a quality and a consistency of building regs. It's too easy at the moment for quality and desktop building regs to be approved or assessments to be approved. And actually, we need to be getting to a point where quality, whether it's fire safety, whether it's room sizes or wherever it is done consistently in-house with a local authority backing it. Because actually, some of the part of the issues that we see, particularly in the last 15 years of build quality, is that independent assessments not done by a local authority but by a desktop exercise is often causing some of these issues. So there should be some element of legislation around building control being back in-house, is my personal view. I do think there is a huge element around resourcing local authorities. So you will know that most local authorities have had a minimum of 60% budget cuts to local authorities. So it's not just about kind of having enough planners, it's also understanding that the housing revenue account for social housing or council housing stock is probably at its peak at the moment. So how do we resource local authorities, not just in planning, but in the wider piece, to make sure that it's responsive enough to what our housing needs are? And in terms of viability, I think what we do in Brent, and I think it's something that we could be rolled out beyond, is actually, Sadiq's been very good at getting 35% affordable on big schemes, but actually what we've done is actually every phase we look at clawback. So we review every phase of a development that a developer comes forward and then say, actually, look at the margins again and say, can you provide even more affordable than what was originally agreed in the master plan? So making sure that actually any opportunity local authorities got to kind of increase the social housing and affordable numbers we take. But I think this is an element of opportunity. I don't think, similar to what Rachael was saying earlier, we have to take this as a point of the first step and be optimistic about what can be achieved. I don't think there's any person within the housing sector, whether you're a developer, whether you're a planner, whether you're a political lead like myself, or even just somebody interested in housing who can't get onto the housing ladder, doesn't want this to work. So I think it's incumbent upon us as a collective to see what are the obstacles and how can we remove them but also building in safeguards to make sure quality is there. So I think it's an opportunity for us to really be radical, to be optimistic, and push Matthew and Angela to say, this is what we need to come forward. How can we best make it happen? And I think the community involvement is massive. We don't move away from community involvement, but like Russell said earlier, I think that's paramount that we do it at the local plan stage, so that people feel real ownership of what's coming to their communities, and not be kind of, blindsided. We should make planning a forward-thinking, optimistic tool rather than an automatic negative objective tool to stop something. I think that's how we need to be seeing it. But I'll leave it at that because I think there's plenty to talk about. But for me, this is a start. And for me, what I'm seeing is very excited.
Thanks very much for that, Shama. I mean, there's been a lot in the chat, and I think that the one thing that I think everybody has been saying almost, and Shama, you said it quite a lot in your. It's not a simple fix. It's not just one thing. That we almost need to be looking at everything, and it's not all about planning. There are other things that come into it, and it's not all going to be in one document. And of course, way out at the front of this in terms of affordable housing is the affordability and what finance is going to be put in to allow us to build more affordable housing. So there's an
can I just make one very quick point just on what you just said, and I had it on my notes. It's about how we finance housing generally. Currently, borrowing for building, whether you're public or private, is so expensive. So actually there's an incumbency or kind of obligation almost on the Treasury to see how can we make building homes affordable. So bringing Public Works Loan Board, the percentage of interest rates, bringing that back down to make it affordable for councils and housing providers is a kickstart that we can work with developers to make it happen. How can we make it easier for people to get a mortgage? So you're creating that kind of flow in the system. So it's a real big question about how we finance housing, and that's one of the big questions I think the Treasury needs to be asked, not just MHCLG.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Alison's got a hand up already. If anybody else has got anything, there's been a lot of comment in the chat, so if anybody wants to pick up on anything that was in the chat as well, just please put your hand up. We've only got about 6 minutes, but hey, get going.
So it's just a quick question for our speakers and other people on the call, really maybe put in the chat, thinking about the response that we're going to pull together as a result of the event tonight. So I think we need to be more sophisticated around the 1.5 and actually have an aspiration for affordable housing, genuinely affordable housing within that. And I just, and Tom said he agreed with that, and I just wondered whether there's any sort of consensus around that, because that's the kind of thing we'll be able to feed back as part of our response. Or is the feeling, well, if we hit 1.5 million, it doesn't matter what they are because it's such a it's such a change that it will trickle down and everyone will be fine. You could tell which I think from that.
Well, yes, I think I would agree with that. I'm not sure, maybe we need some thumbs ups from people if they would agree with that. Certainly in areas like in London where housing is so expensive, if you don't say there must be affordable housing, we will not get it. As simple as that, because you can sell housing for ridiculous figures in the center of cities, and that's what developers will do if they don't have to provide it. Russell, you've got a hand up.
Sorry. Yeah, so this has been talked about a little bit tonight. Small sites, and I think we need to stop thinking about small site development as just sort of windfall. Actually, it has a huge strategic opportunity. And I know that the MHCL, I had a meeting with MHCLG last week about this, and looking at ways of accelerating delivery of small sites, both in terms of house building itself, but also local economies I mentioned earlier. There was an example from Croydon, which has been famously quoted recently, but in 3 years, Croydon built, and that's built, not consented, built 2,000 homes on small sites and on housing developments of fewer than 10 homes. And it did that because it introduced a predictable planning system. And the problem is that planning policy was then scuppered by an incoming Tory mayor. But if we had something like that at national level, I mean, I calculated there's something like 900,000 homes on small sites just by a 25% uplift in density in London suburbs within 800 meters of a station. The opportunity is huge, but we need to start thinking about it strategically rather than just sort of an incidental or windfall sites.
Okay, brilliant, great. Bob Colner, can I bring you in, and then Shama's got a hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of very quick points. Nobody's mentioned the 5-year land supply thing, which, remember, the Tories included that in their previous NPPF, and there was a big fuss made in different communities about it because they thought it was being widely gamed by developers pushing development on sites that weren't allocated in local plans, etc. And I'm really surprised to find it's still in the NPPF, in the revised one. And I just think the housing group should look at that one. Secondly, the point about 1.5 million, to me, it doesn't mean anything unless we say, as Labour Housing Group, what percentage of that should be social housing. I mean, I think it just, a figure means nothing. It could all be, luxury flats. I mean, would that be okay? Do you know what I mean? We've got to be clear about what we mean by 1.5. Thank you.
Heather, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted myself. I was getting feedback. Shama, can I just bring you in?
Yeah, a couple of points. I think initially just reacting to Bob's point about the 5-year land supply. I'm actually in favour of keeping the 5-year land supply, speaking as the planning policy lead in my authority, simply because it allows for that certainty that Russell was talking about, that people know what's coming. And we did a really strong engagement process with the community about what land we would be willing to release, what land is allocated for brownfield sites, what's leisure use. So we want to give certainty not just to the developers and people applying for planning permission, but to our communities too. So I think it's important that we maintain a kind of a certainty within the system, because part of the issues are the uncertainty of it all. I think around the percentages, I think my understanding is that any green belt release or grey belt release has a percentage of 50%. So I think it's almost arbitrary about how much of that 1.5 million has to be social, because it will depend on the site about viability. And I think we have to be open, I think, as a party and as a movement, that viability, we have to change what viability and how viability is calculated before we can actually go down the road of how much percentage we're going to talk about. So do we include land value as part of viability assessments, or are we happy to say that in areas like London, like our big cities, we're going to accept higher density and height to enable viability, to allow that increase of percentages of housing need? And I would argue that actually, speaking as a local authority leader where we've got massive need for family units, social housing units need to also be family-sized units, because that's where we've got huge need. Brent, it takes us 10 years to get at least a 3-bedroom home if you're on the social housing list. So actually there needs to be a conversation about what the social housing is, not just the numbers, because otherwise you could have a whole block of 1-bed flats that isn't going to serve a local need. So I think the need and homes need to come from the local authority and what their needs are. It is my personal view. But I completely understand the kind of the premise around social housing.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly would agree with that last comment coming from a local authority. I mean, people are spending inordinate amounts of time on the waiting list, and also people are spending inordinate amounts of time in really overcrowded conditions with absolutely no hope. And in fact, the overcrowding sometimes only gets resolved when the children leave home. So, you know, the overcrowding leaves them rather than them leaving the overcrowding. So can I just hand back to Alex, because I think we're just about out of time, and I think you should wrap up for us.
Yes, God, thank you all so much for a fantastic event and discussion of what should be in the new Labour government's NPPF. So as discussed, we'll put this event up on Labour Housing Group's Spotify. After this, people can listen back. And I'll be writing up an event report for Red Brick blog, which will also send to the government, the housing ministers, as part of the NPPF consultation. We hope everyone here, if you are a Labour member, has had a chance to join LHG, and that you can kind of continue with us in future events. We're going to be doing some planning events up in person in Birmingham in November. It'll be great to see you guys there. And also hope to see you guys at Labour Party conference. Actually, Sheila, before we go, do you want to quickly plug our conference events programme before we call it a day?
Oh, yes, thank you. We've got 4 events. We have a rally for social housing, which is on the Sunday at 4:30 in the Novotel. And that's a whole load of quickfire inputs from councillors, MPs, lots of new MPs, and the Minister for Housing, and some community groups and homeless sector groups and housing sector. So that's on the Sunday. If you see it in the published printed programme, it says it's on Monday, but it isn't. It's on Sunday at 4:30 in Novotel. On the Monday, we have 2 events, one about turning houses into homes, and that's at 4:30 in the Hilton Hotel. And then we have an event at 6, which is about housing equality. How do we make sure there's housing for all, to meet all the different needs? And then finally, on the Tuesday lunchtime, just before the leader's speech, we have an event about how we reach 1.5 million homes. How do we get there? So do come along if you're at conference. The only one that's in the secure zone is the last one, which is just as well, because it'll give people time to zoom from the conference, the meeting room into the conference centre to hear the leader's speech.
Well, thanks, Sheila. And on that, we'll call it an evening. Again, thanks so much to all our speakers. Thank you much to Russell for presenting and to our chairs for leading the discussion. We'll see you all hopefully at conference.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.